pretend to be like mid? Should I pretend to be? You want me to? Let's, you bet.
Good evening. My name is Peter Meehan, and I'm the president of St. Jerome's University. It's my great pleasure to welcome you once again to the Lectures in Catholic Experience. We'll begin with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge with respect that St. Jerome's University and the University of Waterloo reside and operate on the traditional territory of the Attawandaron, the Anishinaabe, and the Haudenosaunee peoples. Our university is situated on the Haldeman Tract, the land Frederick Haldeman granted to the Haudenosaunee of the Six Nations of the Grand River in 1784, and that includes 10 kilometers on both sides of the Grand River and extends from its source to Lake Erie. We give thanks for the privilege to live and work on this land, and we are committed to building respectful relationships with Indigenous people and communities to enhance our knowledge and to learn how we can have an active role in reconciliation. I'll just say something briefly about the Lectures in Catholic Experience. Since 1982, St. Jerome's University has offered Lectures in Catholic Experience to our local community, providing opportunities for us to engage with the critical issues of our times. We have invited scholars, activists, experts, and religious leaders to address subjects including religion and politics, spirituality, ecology, religious pluralism, ecumenism, interfaith dialogue, religion and the media, among others. This year's theme for the lectures, Living Mission in the Margins, brings together a series of talks by speakers who help us to explore the importance of Christian mission through their overarching concern for individuals, experiences, and questions, who help us to see the face of Christ, who leads us always to understand and to care for those on the margins. For this evening's talk, Anne of Austria's surgeon, François Gendron, the 17th century Jesuit mission to the Wendat, and the history of medicine, we're very pleased to welcome Professor Micah True. The French surgeon François Gendron, who lived between 1618 and 1688, served the Jesuit mission to the Wendat as a voluntary laborer for 6 years, from 1643 until 1649. Later in life, he treated the Queen Mother of France, Anne of Austria's breast cancer, using a remedy of his own device that appears to have been inspired by the indigenous practices they learned about at the Wendat mission. Gendron's story is not unknown, but he has mostly been remembered in Canada and in France inaccurately, in both cases, as the first European physician to live in what is now Ontario, and as a charlatan who took advantage of an ailing royal. In this lecture in Catholic Experience, Micah True shows how accounting for the life and experiences of this little-studied participant in the Jesuit mission in New France yields important insights for our understanding of the earliest decades of settled Canada and how the knowledge produced in the Jesuit missions there was received in France. Micah True is a professor of French and folklore 17th Century New France, published by McGill Queen's University Press in 2015, and the translator of the Jesuit Pierre-François Xavier de Charlevoix's 1974. That's my mistake. 1744, the epistolary account of his voyage through North America, published in Brill's Jesuit Studies series in 2019. His new book, published in 2025 by McGill Queen's, is The Jesuit Relations, a Biography. Please join me in welcoming Professor Micah True.
Well, thank you, Peter, for that warm welcome, and thanks everyone for coming. I'm just thrilled to be here to share my new research with you. It is not my intention to read to you for the next 35 minutes, but old habits die hard, so I hope you will forgive me if you catch me dipping into my notes. There's a curious story that is sometimes told about a French surgeon named François Gendron, who spent 7 years working in the Jesuit mission to the Wendat in the 1640s. The way it is usually told goes something like this. While practicing his trade at the mission headquarters at Sainte Marie, near what is now Midland, Ontario, Gendron learned of mineral deposits at the bottom of Niagara Falls that were useful for treating wounds, fistulas, and ulcerated cancerous tumors, and that were therefore an important trade good for nearby Indigenous peoples. He called them Erie stones after the lake in which they formed, even though they were not, strictly speaking, stones, and he carried this knowledge of their healing properties back to France when he returned home in 1650. There, he joined the priesthood and put a new version of this remedy, or in some versions of the story, the Erie stones themselves, to work treating the poor. After 1964, to treat the cancer that had steadily been growing for about a year on the left breast of Anne of Austria, the Queen Mother and former regent of France. Gendron managed to soothe the worst of her symptoms, her pain in particular, which is about all anyone could have hoped for, and her inevitable death from her illness came in January 1666. This story first captured my attention as a classic example of a traveler's tale, of the kind that proliferated in the 17th century as missionaries and would-be settlers departed France for unfamiliar lands across vast oceans and then returned home to share what they had experienced out there. Indeed, most versions of the story explicitly claim that the remedy Gendron used on Anne of Austria was directly related to the one he learned from the Wendat, whom he called Huron. I'll be using the currently preferred name Wendat tonight, but you'll also hear Huron in the sources I'm citing, just to avoid any confusion. These are two names for the same people. And that Gendron himself was responsible for making this connection widely known. To give you just one example, a historical novel published in France just last year features Gendron patiently explaining his remedy to King Louis XIV. This balm is not of my own making, Your Majesty. I adapted it from a remedy used by the Huron Indians to relieve the pain caused by certain deep ulcerations that we here have taken to calling cancers. This rock from our region is exactly like the stones the Indigenous people gathered below the gigantic falls where Lake Erie, said to be as vast as the sea, plunges dramatically into Lake Ontario. It was with the ash of these calcined stones that the Huron people made this remedy. I chose to show you an example from fiction because it's both very recent and written in a particularly engaging manner, but this is also representative of how the story has been told in scholarship and in journalistic writing in about the last 100 years or so. Although other aspects of Gendron's story are well attested in the historical record, I've come to realize that these two parts of it in particular, the relationship between the two remedies and Gendron's role in making the relationship known, are much less certain. What initially seemed to me to be the story of a traveler triumphantly returning home and proudly touting his discovery of a wondrous indigenous remedy appears, on closer examination, to instead be a case of potential inspiration that remains uncertain, largely due to the choices made by Gendron himself. Tonight, I'd like to tell you what I have learned so far about Gendron's medical adventures on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean on the basis of about a year spent tracing this story through the printed sources that have informed most scholarly versions of it, as well as handwritten records that are tucked away in various archival collections in France. I hope to show you that the differences between the usual version of the story and the underlying historical events offer lessons about how information gathered in the New France missions may have shaped France's evolving scientific knowledge about the power journeys like the one undertaken by Gendron exercise on our imaginations, and about the man himself, who probably deserves more credit as a serious medical experimenter than he sometimes receives. I'll start by telling you a bit more about François Gendron, his experiences in the Wendat mission, and what we know about his encounter with the Erie stones, and then I'll share the results of my efforts so far to trace the connection between the so-called Erie stones and the remedy Gendron later put to use in treating Anne of Austria. You could think of this lecture as a kind of preliminary sketch of the book I'm considering writing about Gendron's extraordinary life, its potential value as a case study for the transatlantic history of medicine, and the enduring narrative appeal of stories like the one I started with. So first, let's examine in more detail how this French surgeon came to be aware of the mineral deposits at the bottom of Niagara Falls. And I can't resist immediately deviating from the agenda that I just set out for myself to tell you a brief story about my own journey of discovery as I've been trying to gather all of the surviving traces of Gendron's life. This portrait that you're looking at of Gendron late in life is hanging on the wall in the home of one of his indirect descendants, whom I managed to track down in France last year. And when I traveled to the small town just a couple hours south of Paris where she lives to meet her and to examine her collection of Gendron's 17th century papers, I spotted this portrait at the top of the stairs in her house just outside the room where the papers are kept. And I almost fell down the stairs because this is a previously unknown portrait. There is another portrait of him that is around. You can probably find it on the internet, but this one I had never seen before. And so it was a surprise. And you can see that it also seems to have fallen down the stairs at some point, or at least off the wall. It's a little banged up. So this is just one item related to Gendron's life and career that is held in this private collection, handed down through the generations of the family. I'll be drawing on a few other items in their collection a bit later, but for now, back to what I originally promised you, telling you about how this surgeon came to learn about the Erie stones. François Gendron was born and raised in the farming community of Vauve, just south of the cathedral town of Chartres, and just about all that we know about his early life is contained in parish registers. He was the son of a farmer named Éloi Gendron and his wife Gillette Ducineau, baptized on April 18th, 1618, and the 8th of 9 children who survived infancy. After that, complete mystery until he's about the age of 25. This isn't surprising. This is not a wealthy family or a well-known family, so the early years are very hazy. But we know that in January 1643, a few months shy of his 25th birthday, he had earned the credential of journeyman surgeon from the hospital in Orléans after several years studying as an apprentice under a master surgeon. Just to give you a quick geographic orientation here, this is where in France Gendron spent the part of his life that unfolded there. Paris is the red dot, Vauve is the red square, and then Orléans is the red triangle part just in the middle of France. So this is what we're talking about in France. Within months of earning journeyman status, and with it the right to work independently as a surgeon, that is, without the supervision of a master surgeon, Gendron embarked on one of the merchant ships that crossed the ocean every spring and summer, loaded with fresh supplies for Jesuit missionaries and settlers there, as well as new residents for the fledgling colony. Artisans, laborers, missionaries, and men like Gendron, whose training made them valuable additions to the efforts of the Society of Jesus in New France. He had traveled to Quebec to replace René Goupil, a fellow surgeon who had been captured and killed by the Haudenosaunee the previous year. And I imagine that this name is probably familiar to many of you as a martyr and a saint, quite a well-known figure in the history of the mission. To replace Goupil, who had just died violently. He must have understood that this was dangerous, and he wrote that this was motivated by a desire to learn in particular, which is maybe a surprising reason to give for this journey, given why he was making it, or the events that precipitated his journey. He wrote, "The land of the Hurons is one of the most beautiful and pleasant I have seen since curiosity brought me to travel to these foreign lands. For one does not see there those hideous faces of barren rocks and mountains as is seen in most other Canadian lands." Yeah, I enjoyed that too. And from there, he enumerates all of his favorite parts of the Wendat territory, the actual beauty he encountered there. The former Jesuit mission superior Paul Lejeune, on the other hand, attributed to Gendron professions of deep faith as a motivation for this journey to this part of the world when he reported meeting the newly arrived surgeon in Quebec just as he was preparing to depart for Sainte Marie. This is what Lejeune wrote about it. I, seeing him on the point of going up to the Hurons, represented to him all the perils into which he was about to plunge. I foresee all that, he said to me. If my designs tended only to the earth, your words would give me terror, but my heart, desiring only God, fears nothing more. So this is Lejeune's recollection of what Gendron had said to him. This is not what Gendron himself said about his motivations. He only talked about his curiosity, but I do think that it's fair to conclude that one does not make a journey like this absent some sort of deep-seated conviction, and that's normally been interpreted as religious faith. Another quick geographic orientation for those of you who aren't very familiar with this, where these events unfolded maybe. Quebec is the red dot here. Sainte Marie on the shores of Lake Huron is the red square. And as you can see, that's quite a distance. This is a trek of 3 to 4 weeks. Would risk confrontation with Indigenous groups who were in conflict with the French and their Indigenous allies at this time. So that could have shortened the trip to about 2 weeks, but in most cases, this was 3 to 4 weeks tromping through the woods. Niagara Falls, which will also enter our story, is the green triangle. And as you can see, it's not by any means around the corner from Sainte Marie. It's on the other side of Lake Ontario. The thing I want to make sure you understand about this is that for Gendron, it would not have been a simple matter of popping around the corner to visit Niagara Falls whenever he wanted to get any of the Erie Stones. This was quite a significant distance. Upon his arrival at Sainte Marie, after the weeks-long trek from Quebec, Gendron joined a special class of mission workers known as donnés, meaning given men in French, invoking the gift of their own labor they made to the Jesuit missionaries. Worked in the mission in return for room and board, but no pay. And at least in theory, this was a lifelong commitment to serve the mission in this way. They usually performed the kinds of everyday chores that were necessary for the smooth functioning of the mission settlement and that would otherwise have to be handled by the missionaries, consuming precious time that they might otherwise have spent on their efforts to convert the Wendat and minister to the converted. So the donnés did things like raising livestock, raising food crops, serving as paddlers and porters for long journeys between mission settlements, including the yearly round trip to Quebec, chopping firewood, repairing shoes, erecting buildings, pretty much anything you can think of. Any labor that needed to be performed, the donnés might be involved in doing so. And I'll just say in passing that I am fascinated by the donnés, in large part because they go almost completely unmentioned in the missionaries' annual reports, the famous Jesuit relations that were published every year and that constitute our largest source of information on the Wendat mission. And the reason for this silence is that when the Society of Jesus authorities in Rome became aware of the existence of this special class of mission laborers, they were, let's just say, less than thrilled. They even ordered at one point that the donnés be released from their commitments and that this special class of mission laborers cease to exist. The reasons for this is that they were concerned that this financial commitment that had been made to support these men for the rest of their lives could become burdensome at one point. In the early days of the donnés, there were also some who took particular vows. Some of them wore a particular habit. And so this sort of quasi-religious status of the donnés caused a lot of unease in Rome. And because of the back and forth that unfolded over the course of several years between mission authorities and the Jesuit hierarchy in Rome, there's a real uneasiness in the Jesuit sources to say anything about the donnés. So all of this to say they're a mysterious, kind of shadowy group of laborers who contributed to the mission in many ways and whose stories can only be pieced together from fleeting glimpses here and there in the historical record. That's probably another lecture for another day, but I just wanted to mention this is a really interesting group of people, and Gendron was one of them. Unlike the others who were doing things like repairing shoes or chopping firewood, Gendron was clearly primarily occupied with seeing to the medical needs of the missionaries, their paid laborers, the other donnés, and also indigenous Christians who were sometimes present at Sainte Marie. A certificate signed by the mission superior Paul Ragueneau that Gendron took with him when he returned to France attests to this, highlighting Gendron's charity, his skill in treating various illnesses, and his valuable ability to make effective remedies for many different ailments. And let's just linger on that for a minute. He's in a completely unfamiliar environment. Many of the ingredients for remedies that may have been familiar to him were not at his immediate disposal. So he had to concoct remedies from materials that were unfamiliar to him, under pressure, and without being able just to run to Quebec to buy whatever he needed, because that was quite a long ways away. At least by Ragueneau's testimony, he was very successful in finding ways to treat the various illnesses he encountered at Sainte Marie. But there's another part of Gendron's story, and that is that he did not merely stay at Sainte Marie practicing medicine, practicing surgery. He also left the mission headquarters whenever he could, traveling far and wide in search of new experiences. And we know this because there's a compilation of 3 of his letters from the Wendat mission entitled Quelques particularités du pays des Hurons, some particularities of the land of the Hurons, that provides glimpses of the restless and curious spirit of a man who was frequently in motion in search of new information. After describing Lake Huron, for example, Gendron revealed that his knowledge of what lay beyond it came from personal experience. He wrote, "The freshwater sea," this is what he called Lake Jesuit fathers had built in this country, has communication with two other even larger lakes bordered by various nations not yet instructed in the faith for lack of apostolic workers, and I believe of means to be able to maintain them there. I will speak to you elsewhere on this subject, having recently returned from that country. To give you just another example, of the peoples living to the north of the Wendat, Gendron wrote, "From the northern side of the Huron territory, there are various Algonquin nations who do not cultivate the land and who live only by hunting and fishing as far as the North Sea. I will save for another time, speaking to you more fully about these nations that I hope to visit in a short time." These letters about these nations that I hope to visit in a short time. These letters give the impression on one. And there's also some corroboration for this in the rest of the historical record. The Jesuit missionary Charles Garnier, for example, wrote letters to his brother back in France that have survived. And these indicate to us that Gendron very often accompanied Garnier in particular as he was visiting various mission outposts. So Gendron's own letters and the rest of the historical record pretty clearly testify to his deep curiosity and a traveler's impulse to learn as much as he could about his new surroundings. He was always traipsing off into the woods in search of a new experience. It could have been during one of these journeys away from the relative safety of Sainte Marie that Gendron encountered the so-called Erie Stones. The same collection of letters that I was just telling you about records his frequent journeys includes the following passage, which comes just after a description of Niagara Falls. "From the foam of these waters leaping at the foot of certain large rocks found in this place, a stone is formed, or rather a petrified salt, of a color tending a little toward tumors." And then a little bit longer, further on, they being indigenous people living nearby, also trade these Erie stones, so named because of this lake, to carry and distribute them to other nations. As the starting point for the story of Gendron's use of an indigenous is disappointingly short on details. Did he travel to the bottom of Niagara Falls himself, or did he learn about the Erie stones, their healing properties, and their value as a trade good from someone he encountered elsewhere, perhaps a visitor to the hospital at Sainte Marie? Did he experiment with the healing properties of the Erie stones himself, or even ever possess any of them? And how 1960 text based on Gendron's letters from Sainte Marie does not, unfortunately, provide any answers to these questions, although it does unmistakably record Gendron's awareness of a mineral deposit at the bottom of Niagara Falls that he understood to be used by Indigenous people to treat malignant wounds of the kind he would encounter years later at Anne of Austria's sickbed. It was within a year and a half of writing these words that Gendron left Sainte Marie, having witnessed the aftermath of the martyrdom of Jean de Brébeuf and 3 other Jesuits in 1649, and the subsequent dispersal of the Wendat at the hands of Haudenosaunee warriors. He returned to France the same year the mission fell, 1650, became a priest, and resumed his surgical career, at least initially working primarily among the poor. Whether he took any of these mysterious mineral deposits from the bottom of Niagara Falls with him when forced to leave the mission in haste, I cannot say. Let's turn now to the second part of the story I started with, Gendron's treatment of Anne of Austria's breast cancer. Curiously, given the high profile of the patient, the precise nature of the remedy Gendron used does not seem to have been widely known at the time. Even France's most illustrious medical authorities, who understandably took a close interest in the Queen Mother's illness, were in the dark. In a letter written in late December 1664, for example, one of several letters from this particular writer dismissing Gendron as a charlatan, the dean of the Faculty of Medicine in Paris, Guy Patin, wrote, "Some claim that the Queen's tumor on her left breast is not dangerous. I wish they were certain of that, but I don't believe it. A priest was brought in from near Orléans who, with his secrets and his plasters, promised miracles. But God performs his great miracles all by himself, and even then, they rarely happen. Everyone is subject to the laws of nature, great and small." Similarly, the memoirist Françoise Berthaud de Motteville, a confidant of Anne of Austria and a member of her household, whose writings are now one of the primary surviving records of the Queen Mother's illness, was unable to say what exactly Gendron used to treat his illustrious patient. She wrote only that the Queen Mother followed his advice, even with some hope of a cure or a long life. For this man promised her that he would harden her breast like a stone and that afterwards she would live as long as if she had never had cancer. But Gendron was not speaking in good faith, for besides the fact that his remedy was new and he hadn't tested it enough to vouch for it, a young woman whom we soon met, to whom he had given it, became very ill and her breast had ruptured. This remedy was hot and therefore it was violent. So that's all these two well-positioned witnesses seem to have known about this remedy. And I'll also just point out that this is markedly different from what Gendron seems to have claimed himself, that he would only be able to soothe her pain. He doesn't, in any of his surviving writings, indicate that he had promised a miraculous cure. This lack of clarity around the nature of the remedy seems to be the result of Gendron's own choices. In a handwritten account of his time at the French court that seems as if it may have been intended for publication or at least to be shared with interested parties, Gendron coyly recounted his conversation with King Louis XIV about the nature of the remedy. He wrote, "Following a conversation that lasted at least 3/4 of an hour with no one else present but His Royal Highness, the king asked me if I would tell him the secret of my sachet. To which I replied that I had no secret and did not wish to have any secret for His Majesty. At the same time, I told him something about my method, which he greatly approved." Perhaps Gendron did tell the king about the origin and composition of this remedy, as the author of the novel I mentioned earlier imagined. Indeed, it's hard to imagine him defying a direct request from the king, but his own account of their conversation, apparently intended to share the story with others, hints that he may not have fully disclosed the nature of the treatment. He told the king only something of his method, and in any case, this account itself does not include any details of the remedy, leaving intact what seems to have been the prevailing impression at the time. This was a secret he was unwilling to share. There are many signs that this preference for secrecy was a pattern throughout Gendron's life and his approach to medical knowledge, that he kept his remedies close to the vest, both before and after this turn in the royal spotlight. For example, he does not seem to have intended his description of the Erie stones to become public at all. The text composed of his letters from Sainte Marie that I've already talked about a little bit was published in 1660. It was appended right at the end, almost as an afterthought, to a volume on the Americas of a multi-volume anthology purporting to describe every part of the world. And these letters were prepared for publication by a historian who's now almost entirely forgotten, named Jean-Baptiste de Rocolle, who took the three letters, removed the salutations and valedictions, edited them down, and turned them into a single text instead of three distinct letters. Rocolle specified in an introductory paragraph that he put at the beginning of the resulting text that these letters had come into his hands via an unspecified friend, apparently not one of the correspondents to whom Gendron had originally written. And Gendron himself does not seem to have participated in the publication of these letters or even necessarily to have been aware of it. I found no other sign anywhere that Gendron ever sought to make the existence of the Erie Stones public knowledge. This seems to have happened despite him. In the final decade or so of his life, to give you another example, Gendron continued to keep his medical knowledge under wraps, closely guarded. He published a book near the end of his life called Principaux remèdes de Monsieur l'Abbé Gendron, main or principal remedies of Monsieur l'Abbé Gendron. And just a quick digression about this book, because I'm pretty fascinated by this book. It's a mysterious little volume. It doesn't contain any information about when it was published. There's no date on it. There's no indication of where it was printed or by whom. Some of you may have already noticed that the spelling is pretty strange, even for 17th century France. He seems to be using a proposed reformed spelling created by one of his close friends. We can speculate that this was probably published sometime around 1687, so 1 year before Gendron's death, and that's because it's mentioned in a letter that a friend of his wrote to the English, mentioned in footnotes of studies that draw on John Locke's correspondence, but it's always listed as missing. If you search the internet for it, you will not find it. If you search library catalogs across the world, you will not find it. I happen to have found this copy in the collection of the family who still has Gendron's papers. So fascinating book that we could probably talk about for a very long time. But for my purposes today, it's interesting because it lists and describes Gendron's methods of treating various ailments late in his career, very close to the end of his life. To show you just one representative example, the book touts the efficacy of Gendron's method of treating ulcers and fistulas in these terms. I have found through experience that these troquisques contain the virtue of all other caustics and that they act in a very particular way. This is why those who have seen me treat ulcers, fistulas, and countless other extraordinary ailments know that this remedy is the one I most often use in practice to subdue their malignancy and more easily achieve a cure. And a troquisque, by the way, is like a cake of soap, but it's a cake of medicine instead. So it's medicinal ingredients formed into the shape of a little cake to facilitate storage and later use. What is striking about this, for a book that purports to share Gendron's medical knowledge, the composition of this remedy and the method for preparing it go entirely unspecified. There's no indication of what was in the troquisque in this book. And this is also true of all the other remedies that are mentioned in the book. The actual recipe for this remedy he reserved for a private notebook, which happily has also survived. If you probably can't see that, but on the right side of your screen, you might be able to make out the word troquisque at the top. Here, this section echoes the language I just showed you in the printed text, word for word. Grind all of this into a very fine powder, then thoroughly mix and knead it all together with 1.5 ounces of leaven, moistened with saliva, and from all this, you will form troquisque of any size. I assume you won't be lining up to acquire this remedy. All three of these examples, the Erie stones, the remedy Gendron used on Anne of Austria, and his descriptions of his remedies from late in life, suggest a long-standing pattern. Gendron was happy to trumpet the efficacy of his treatments, but preferred to keep their details private. And I'll also just mention in passing that this notebook that I'm talking about contains no mention. And this is the only place I have found where his remedies are actually described in any kind of detail. It seems to have been only decades after the fact that after Gendron's appearance at Anne of Austria's sickbed, that a description of the remedy he used there was finally made public. And these details came in a book on the nature and treatment of cancer published in 1700 by Gendron's own grandnephew, the physician Claude Gendron. And he wrote, their preparation at the time consisted of calcining, that's burning, roasting, certain porous gray stones, which are found in some places in Beauce. He then extinguished them in vinegar, and by various lotions, he separated the lixivious salts. Beauce, by the way, is the home region of Gendron, so the area right around his home. Absent from Gendron's book is any mention of a link between this remedy and the Erie stones, although elsewhere in his book, he explained that his great uncle's success in soothing the Queen Mother's pain, where others had failed, was a result of, quote, the difference between someone who based his skill on a remedy derived from Paracelsus and Valhelmont and someone who, through a long series of experiences during his travels, had acquired particular knowledge of the ailments that are the subject of surgery. So Gendron connected his great uncle's cancer remedy to he seems to have mentioned this mostly as a way of scoring points against the theoretically trained physicians of his time versus the more experimentally oriented surgeons like his uncle. Gendron's account of his great uncle's main ingredient as stones from Beauce seems to rule out one particular, if uncommon, variant of the story with which I began, that Gendron treated Anne of Austria using the very same mineral deposits he found at the bottom of Niagara Falls. This claim, in any case, has always seemed incredible to me because it would have required him to bring back an implausibly large quantity of these mineral deposits, enough to last 15 years of surgical practice until his encounter with the Queen Mother. But I think it's worth hesitating over Gendron's report that his great-uncle's remedy was made using stones from Beauce at the time, as if to signal that his approach to treating cancer was different at various moments of his career. It's important to know that Gendron's trade, surgery, was not, as it is in our own time, an advanced specialization for those who were already physicians. It was a separate profession focused on treating external injuries and ailments, in contrast to the physicians of the time who were steeped in tradition and trained in classrooms and usually viewed illness and healing as a matter of balance between the four humors. Gendron was the kind of healer in 17th century France who trained in an apprenticeship and then continued learning by doing, developing, refining, and perfecting his remedies through experimentation and direct observation of how various substances affected particular ailments or wounds. All of his remedies were built on what he had observed before. In this sense, the Erie stones surely did inform his treatment of Anne of Austria, whether as a direct source of inspiration or as something he had once learned and then moved on from. If it is not certain that salt deposits from Niagara Falls were directly related to the remedy he developed using stones from Beauce, this is at least plausible. Both were, after all, concocted from minerals and used to treat similar ailments. So what can we make of all of this? What are some lessons to take away? I think, to start with, we're left with a perplexing question. If the available evidence of a connection between the Erie stones and Anne of Austria makes this story no more than plausible, potentially but not certainly true, why is it so often repeated as a fact? It would be easy and lazy, honestly, to dismiss this as an example of carelessness on the part of the scholars, journalists, and writers of historical fiction who have told and retold this story. But I suspect that a better answer lies in the way we tend to think about travel and use travel narratives. Mary Louise Pratt has observed that our scholarly analyses tend to spontaneously follow the traveler author as his reader does and repeat his discourse in our terms as if we were looking over his shoulder as readers and fellow travelers. This is how traveler X saw place Y. The analyst follows the book that follows the trip. We follow along vicariously with travelers like Gendron as we take note of what they learned and how it was different from what was known or done at home. And because the journey is arguably only complete once the traveler has returned home to tell about what he saw out there, which, by the way, is also the necessary ingredient that gives travel narratives a satisfying conclusion, there is a strong presumption that the novel information collected by people like Gendron must have been shared. I've observed this phenomenon in the way scholars have characterized many other texts produced in the New France mission that were never made public at the time. Private journals and letters, preliminary reports, and others, as if we simply cannot imagine that new and potentially valuable information could have been kept private. In Gendron's case, it seems that this perspective on travel has led readers to complete the travel narrative on Gendron's behalf, filling in blanks in the historical record so that the most original and interesting fruits of his journey, the ones about which he seems to have tried to say nothing publicly, can be glimpsed and appreciated. It may be that the distance between Gendron's historical reality and the story we now tell about him is best understood as an illustration of the power that a remarkable journey exercises over our imaginations. As for the facts of this particular case, I remain hopeful that one of the archives in France I have not visited yet may contain a clearer indication of how Gendron's encounter with the Erie stones did or did not inform the remedy he later offered Anne of Austria. And I am also actively seeking traces of the Erie stones or remedies like them in Indigenous knowledge about health and healing, although I have to admit for the moment, I'm not finding very much. But even if the historical reality never becomes any clearer than it is now, there are lessons here for those of us who are invested in assessing the degree to which Indigenous knowledge shaped European life in these earliest decades of settled Canada. Gendron's story, with all of its uncertainty, and known only because the details he seems to have tried to keep private escaped containment, is a powerful reminder that Indigenous ways of knowing and doing could have made their way back to Europe in the 17th century with no fanfare and without anyone noticing at the time, in the possession of travelers who, for whatever reason, chose to keep these lessons to themselves, even as they put them to use. Gendron's case illustrates the importance of seeking traces of the arrival of Indigenous knowledge on European shores outside the familiar terrain of published travel accounts. How many stories like this one exist only in the form of fragmentary evidence hidden away in archival collections waiting for someone to piece them together. In the final analysis, we are left with quite a different picture of François Gendron than the one we started with. Although the oft-repeated story of the Erie stones tends to portray him as a traveler who returned home and shared the knowledge he acquired from an exotic and perhaps unexpected source, we now know that he was in truth rather secretive about his remedies. Far from building his renown on the lure of the unusual or the exotic, Gendron earned his measure of notoriety through mystique. His treatment of Anne of Austria dramatically elevated his reputation, both in France and beyond its borders during the remainder of his life. After the conclusion of his treatment of Anne of Austria, King Louis XIV appointed Gendron to a patronage position that afforded a steady, lifelong income, which he seems to have used to construct a hospital for the poor. He entered into correspondence with the famous English physician and philosopher John Locke, as I already mentioned, whose own letters are full of praise for Gendron's medical acumen. They also seem to have sent remedies back and forth to each other. There's a very interesting smudge of plant matter, I don't know what it is, in Gendron's papers that is identified as a treatment for rabies that John Locke had sent to him. Very curious about what that might be, I don't know. And finally, two of Gendron's indirect descendants in two different generations appended his last name to theirs in homage to their illustrious ancestor and no doubt also to advance their own medical careers, testifying to a favorable reputation for Gendron that persisted even long after his own death in 1688. It has to be admitted then that Gendron's choice to keep his medical knowledge private seems to have worked out rather well for him. But it is also probably why he is sometimes now remembered as a charlatan in our own time, especially in scholarly accounts of Anne of Austria's life. The Queen Mother's illness is now usually understood in scholarship through the testimony of figures like Guy Patin and Madame de Motteville, who, as we saw earlier, were suspicious of Gendron's secrets and hostile to his status as an experimenter rather than a classically trained physician. Gendron was certainly no charlatan. As I have shown you tonight, the surviving traces of his life make clear, if nothing else, that he was a serious medical practitioner, one whose career spanned an ocean and offers important lessons about how we understand transatlantic travel during the 17th century, as well as Europe's reception of the knowledge travelers like Gendron brought home from North America. Thank you.
Thank you, Micah. If people have questions, we have microphones at 3 different locations there. Micah will direct his own traffic, and we welcome questions. Thank you.
So it's thank you for the presentation. It's fascinating. I'm currently the last few years discovering my French Canadian roots going back to 1658. So it's right around that point. I just wanted to say that it's fascinating to hear the journeys and the stories, and like your research. The fact that you were able to do that and dig that far is amazing. Because I know doing my own research, it's not easy. And the historical record is really faint, so especially in those areas. So, thank you.
Thank you very much for the comment. I appreciate that. Yeah.
Just a little, I'm curious as a side note on why the Jesuits were uncomfortable with the Donnée. Can you say a little bit more about it?
Yeah, so this was a model that was borrowed from other Jesuit missionaries, particularly in South America. I think they were called Donados, and the mission superior, Jérôme Lallemand, became aware of this, imported it to the New France mission when he came to become a mission superior at Sainte Marie. And it seemed to him like an ideal solution to a difficult problem. Like, how do you meet all of the basic needs of this community where people have to eat, people have to have clothes, people have to be warm in the winter, and also do the work that you're in New France to do, try to convert the Wendat people. So this was a solution to a problem that existed long before Lallemand's arrival. And it was unpopular in Rome because there had been negative experiences with it in other settings. There had been this concern, you're accepting this gift of a person's life, essentially, meaning that, and that's what it was intended to be. It was intended to last for the person's entire life. What happens if the Wendat mission can't continue to support those people? Does that become a financial burden for the entire Jesuit mission in New France? Does it fall on Rome? There was real uncertainty about where the financial responsibilities for this were, where the buck actually stopped. But I think the bigger problem was also that there was kind of this quasi-religious status for the Donnée, at least initially, particular habits. Some of them were taking vows, and that blurred the lines a little bit too much, I think, for the Jesuit hierarchy in Rome between a lay contributor to the mission and a Jesuit, an actual member of a religious order. So they did abolish the practice. There's a letter saying you have to stop this immediately. All the Donnée are now free. They were not immediately released. There was this back and forth. The letters still exist. They've been published in the Monumenta. You can go look at them if you're really curious. And eventually, Lallemand was able to persuade the Jesuit hierarchy that no, we're not going to do the habits, we're not going to do the vows. They can be sent away for cause. That was another big sticking point. What if one of them does something really bad? Are you still stuck supporting them for the rest of their lives? So once all of that was hammered out, everyone seems to have been more or less okay with the situation. But my strong impression is that it was a difficult enough conversation that nobody wanted to reopen those wounds by writing very much about the données, and that's why they're absent from the relations.
It's a much older tradition in French ecclesiastical institutions, right? To the institution forever. So I mean, this is a much older medieval tradition that the Jesuits are just using because it's been around for centuries at that point. The issue of regulating them is a long-standing one. So it's interesting that ultimately they decide they don't want it, but it's a tradition that had carried on at that point for hundreds of years, and they're just doing what all the other orders had always done with sort of these fratres conversi, these lay brethren who wanted to join and help out. So yeah, really interesting.
I think so. One of the scholars done the most work on this. I think he pinpointed the earliest case of this somewhere around 1100 or something. Just insane.
Yeah, the Cistercians have it, right? So it does go back to the 1100s, but specifically the term, they're dona in the south of France, or donata if they're women. It's like even the term that the Jesuits are using is the late medieval term, as opposed to conversos brothers or something like that. So no, it's a great sort of footnote for the story. Fascinating research, very enjoyable. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Micah. Fascinating topic. I would just be curious in your reading into the relations, the impressions the Jesuits had, if you were able to discover in your readings the impressions Jesuits had of Gendron.
Of the Jesuits had of Gendron?
Yeah.
Yeah. The only traces we have of that or the only traces I have found so far are the ones I showed you. The certificate that Ragueneau wrote, sort of trumpeting Gendron's value to the Jesuits at Sainte Marie. And I think it's a fair question. I didn't get into this in my talk, but why does this certificate exist, right? Gendron is going back to France to resume his life there. Why do we need this sort of attestation of what he'd been up to for 7 years? And it seems to have been meant to position him to resume his work as a surgeon with some account of everything he had done and learned in the previous years. So it's clear that he was very valued as a surgeon at Sainte Marie. And then the only other trace that I know of in the Jesuits' published materials specific to Gendron is what Lejeune said about his deep faith and his pious motivations for making the trip in the first place. But yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Although I will also add that the fact that he became a priest in 1652, very quickly after he gets back to France, suggests that he must have been valued by the Jesuits enough that they could vouch for him as someone who, because it was very quickly after he gets back from France that happens, or back from New France that happens.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for the question.
Thank you so much for the lecture. That's really interesting. I knew about Jean Brébeuf and all the other missionaries in the Wendat region, but I didn't know about him. I want to go. I'm really baffled by Niagara Falls there. I have doubts. As you said, it's far for him to have any contact with Niagara Falls or even the foot of the falls. And so I wonder if in your mind, there are possibilities that this is actually either a Wendat tale, because the Wendat were known to be huge traders across the continent. So I have no doubts that they indeed went as far as Niagara Falls.
Yeah.
But I wonder if that's just a way of making his medication, his treatment, more appealing.
It could be. So I'm also baffled by Niagara Falls. I share your bafflement. There is no record of a journey to Niagara Falls, either in Gendron's writings or any of the Jesuit writings. That doesn't mean it's impossible, because his letters really only reflect the last 2 years or so of his time in the Wendat mission. So he could have visited Niagara Falls previously, and maybe those letters haven't survived. That's certainly a possibility. But as I mentioned in the talk, we can imagine other ways he could have learned about this story or this actual remedy, if that's what it was, without going to Niagara Falls. He doesn't say. We met at Ste. Marie. He could have learned it from a Huron person, and there certainly would have been a language barrier if that was the case. So there's a lot of uncertainty around this story, certainly, which I think is part of the broader story I'm trying to tell here. The story exists because people have connected these very uncertain dots. And I think there's something interesting about the impulse to connect dots under those circumstances. It tells us something about what we expect to get out of travel to a place like that. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And you're an excellent example of connecting dots. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, so thank you for all the questions and your very inspiring talk. So actually, I do have quite a few questions since I also work on 17th century studies, but I've been trying to reduce them into two questions. So the first one is that it's cancer, the term used in the 17th century French text. And the second one is regarding copies of Gendron's book, is there any provenance information? For example, you've mentioned some connections with John Locke in England, and I'm not sure if any provenance research can tell us a bit more about how his knowledge could be circulated and received in England, and also since the treatment happened in Austria, even though in the French context his knowledge, understanding of the indigenous treatment might be more private, but I'm not sure how the information could be circulated among the German-speaking Jesuits or some other people as well.
Mm-hmm. I'll take a stab at the second question first. We do know from the correspondence that Gendron was sending to John Locke. Gendron seems to have picked up right where his great-uncle left off when his great-uncle died. There are letters to Locke, saying, "I am now in possession of my great-uncle's knowledge," and starting his own correspondence with John Locke. And there are indications that he sent actual remedies to John Locke for him to experiment with and see for himself. So whether there was a circulation of this knowledge in England or even in other places is a great question. It's one that I'm not surprised you're asking that way, Al, because I know that that's a special interest of yours. It's not one that I have looked into yet, but that is a useful thing for me to think about as I pursue this, because you're right. This is a transnational epistolary network exchanging medical information at this time, not only across the Atlantic Ocean, but across big parts of Europe. So that will now be a part of the story that I'm looking to tell. And I'm sorry, your first question, Wei Yao, I didn't quite catch it. Can you?
Yeah. Sorry, so I was asking, is cancer the term used in 17th century French sources? Because I remember that in some debates by the Royal Society in the late 17th century, they don't use cancer in English, so I'm not sure.
Yeah, so that's a really great question. Cancer does appear in some of the materials. In other places, it's referred to as a malignant tumor, but it's definitely true that our current understanding of cancer was not the same as in the 17th century. What we're really talking about here is an ulcerated tumor, which is thankfully something that doesn't happen a lot anymore in the era of modern medicine, but an actual cancerous wound that needs medical attention. So yes, untangling exactly what everybody meant by cancer is a tricky part of this project for sure. Yeah. Thank you for the questions.
made my loud way over here. I'm so sorry.
Oh.
Very fascinating talk. Thank you very much. The question that I had, sorry, I was sick. I was just wondering, it's very interesting, the discussion that you had about where he found the information about the Erie Stones. In particular, surrounding like Indigenous oral histories and like tales of the Wendat and whatnot. I was just wondering, as you're looking into the Erie Stones themselves, and you said you were looking, sorry, for more knowledge within the communities to see kind of what is there. What resources were you looking at, and were you having conversations with communities and that sort of thing? What resources?
So I have not gotten to that stage yet, conversations with communities, but it's certainly on the docket. So far, I've been looking at printed sources, both by Indigenous scholars and settler scholars, on Indigenous ideas about health and healing, sort of as a preliminary step to see what is out there before I move on to the next step. And what's striking, I don't know if this tells us more about Indigenous ideas about health and healing or about the perceptions of Western scholars or the Jesuits, but the topic tends to boil down to dreaming. Dreaming as predictive or as related to health and healing. And that can't be the full story. I suspect it's not, but it is interesting to me that that's how it is often framed in the scholarship that exists so far. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for the question.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. It's well informative. I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much. My question is about surgeons, about Gondier and Wendat. What was their reaction to the Indigenous medical practices at Saint Marie at that hospital, especially coming from the European ideal of the four humors?
What was surgeons'
The surgeons, like
reaction to Saint Marie?
Wendat and Gondier, like what were their reactions to Indigenous practices?
Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, Goupil never made it to Saint Marie, so he's murdered on his way to Saint Marie, and that's why Gendron is now accurately remembered as the first Western medical practitioner, not doctor, medical practitioner in Ontario, because Goupil didn't make it. We don't really know, honestly. There is no surviving record that I have found so far where Gendron talks specifically about Indigenous remedies, except apparently for this one. And if this is the only evidence we have of what he understood, at least, to be an Indigenous remedy, we have to conclude that he was a fan, right? He talked about how effective it was, and it was good for these various very serious kinds of conditions like fistulas and ulcerated tumors. So that's not a very complete answer, but it's the most I can tell you for now. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. It's been great.
Thank you so much. We'll let you off the hot seat. Thank you, everyone. My name is Caroline McGregor. I'm the Vice President, Academic and Dean here at St. Jerome's. Please join me once again in thanking our speaker for this evening, Dr. Micah True. A wonderful talk by him and a great set of questions by this audience. So thank you for coming out on what might have been a snowy night or might still become a snowy night. It's my great pleasure to just offer a few quick notes of gratitude and close. So thank you to Norm and the Unmarketing group who've been live streaming this for folks who couldn't join us live in person. The recording of this event is on our YouTube channel, so if you have a friend or colleague who would be interested in this topic but couldn't make it, please do share that recording with them. Thank you to Pam, who provides all this in the lobby there. There are more. Please take some on your way home or stay and visit with friends and colleagues. Thank you to Courtney Winhold in our Marketing Communications Department here at St. Jerome's. If you heard about this event by email or saw it on social media, she is responsible for that, so we're grateful for all of her hard work, and she's been taking pictures tonight as well. Thank you to Patience Silas, who works in my office and does so many different things, including planning a lot of this event. She is back selling some books from Wordsworth. Father Matthew Durham will come on April 23rd to give a lecture on sort of end-of-life care issues from his perspective as a scholar and a practitioner. So we hope to see some of you out for that as well. Have a good evening, everyone.